We're absolutely delighted to be here at the Charles Dickens Museum with Cindy Sughrue, Director of the museum itself, actually standing in Charles Dickens' study, which is just phenomenal and a real privilege. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to welcome you here. And of course, you're celebrating 170 years of fantastic work. And Dickens was an early, if not the first, chairman of the appeal committee for what was then known as the Warehouseman and Clerks Schools, a cause that meant a lot to Dickens, and we can perhaps touch on that as we talk.
Absolutely. So Cindy, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about what was happening in Charles Dickens' life in 1857 when he was chairman of appeal.
This was a really dynamic period of his life. He was at the height of his celebrity. He was known all over the world, and he'd just finished writing and publishing his 11th novel, Little Dorrit. Now, Little Dorrit was really a vehicle for quite dynamic and direct political criticism. It's his most political novel, and it centres around the Dorrit family, who are imprisoned in the Marshalsea debtors' prison, and he's talking about the circumstances of that period of time. And what's also fascinating is that's drawing on Dickens's own experience as a child when his own family was imprisoned for debt when he was 11, just turned 12 years old. So he's writing about something that he knew keenly and felt acutely at the time. By this time, he and his wife Catherine had 9 children, ranging in ages from 5, Edward the youngest, through to 20. Charles Dickens Jr., Charlie, had turned 20 by that stage. And they were also going through a period of quite extreme unhappiness in their marriage. Dickens was casting about for his next idea for a novel. He was under financial pressure, not just because of his growing family, but he'd purchased the first house that he actually owned, Gad's Hill Place, in the village of Higham near Rochester in Kent. He just purchased that, so he had a huge financial burden. And he and Catherine had been unhappy for some years. And in the autumn of 1857, so just weeks before he made that sort of iconic speech for the benefit of the Warehouseman and Clerks Schools, he met and fell in love with a young actress, which would lead the following year to he and Catherine separating. So a lot going on at that time.
Big period of
And
change.
I think a lot of people, he was 45 years old, so he was going through perhaps a classic midlife crisis. But he was, as people often do when they're unhappy or unfulfilled in aspects of their life, they plough themselves into new projects. So he was raising funds for a number of charitable causes and really throwing himself into that work with a huge passion.
What do you think it was about our school as it was then that particularly might have appealed to Charles Dickens?
He gave to a whole range of causes, but those that he got actively involved in, like becoming chairman of an appeal committee, were things that he felt deeply about, and particularly those charitable causes that enabled people to improve their lives and their prospects. So education, both children, he was a big supporter of the ragged schools. In fact, his most famous book, A Christmas Carol, was partly inspired by a visit he'd made to a ragged school in the autumn of 1843 when he started writing that book. So those charities that gave people life skills and opportunities to bring themselves out of poverty and destitution. So those were charities that he really felt would make a huge difference.
So as well as being chairman of appeal for our charity, which other charities was he patron of?
So he was giving donations to a whole range of causes, but those that he got actively involved in, hands-on, were generally around alleviating poverty or unhappiness or distress in children and women and girls. And one that he got involved in 1847 was setting up a place called Urania Cottage. It was a home for homeless women and girls, those that were living on the streets or having to rely on becoming an inmate at the workhouse, or perhaps had been released from prison. So it was sort of halfway house that enabled women and girls to get back on their feet again. Many of them were working as prostitutes, and Dickens, with support from Angela Burdett Coutts, who's one of the most wealthy women on the planet at that time, set up this home. It was in Shepherd's Bush, and Dickens was actively the administrator. He would interview people that were applying to go into the home, and this was something that meant a lot to him, because it provided food and shelter for these women and girls, but it also gave them skills. So an education program, they learned how to keep house, to become seamstresses, and then they were also given financial support to set themselves up either in business or to leave the country. Many of them chose to leave and start their lives over again in Australia or other parts of the empire. And so this was a really active program that Dickens felt he could make a real difference and allow people to develop the skills and means to support themselves. He was also, another favourite institution of his was the Hospital for Sick Children, as it was then known, Great Ormond Street Hospital, and he was the campaign chairman there for a number of years, and he really helped to establish and endow that institution, which of course survives very much so today.
So a lot of these charities really drawing on his experiences as a child, really, wasn't it? And then looking to see, you know, the way out, the way forward, the way to better yourself.
He had those, I suppose the pivotal moment in his childhood is when he was forced to leave school and go into a factory to work to help support his family. And that happened just before his father was arrested and thrown into the Marshalsea debtors' prison. And so he was experiencing firsthand how quickly and easily a family could fall into destitution if they just didn't have the means to keep a roof over their heads and food in their mouths.
So interesting, because I can think of so many parallels with some of the families that contact our charity today in terms of how home circumstances, it can take one instance, one thing to trigger that sort of cycle of different things that are happening at the home, really making it challenging as well. So it's very interesting to draw the parallels.
And it is something that Dickens felt acutely. His family were in and out of poverty throughout his childhood. By the time he and Catherine moved into here in Doughty Street, just as they celebrated their first wedding anniversary, this was the 24th or 23rd address that we know Dickens lived at. And he was only 25 years old. So there were periods of time where they were moving very quickly from one boarding house to another to escape mounting debt. So they would disappear in the night and find somewhere else.
The pressure must have been huge, wasn't it? You know, with 9 children and debt and buying property and so on as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. But he wouldn't have received any monies for working with the charities, would he?
No, not at all.
So totally,
and it was interesting because as he was involved with this charity, he was also making a bit of a change in his career from just relying on writing, either as a journalist or a writer of fiction, to doing more public speaking and readings of his work. So he would do a performed reading of some of his work to raise money for charity, and then he realized it was also a potential income stream for himself. So from the 1850s through to his death in 1870, he kept those things working alongside, running charitable fundraising performances, but also doing tours across the UK and indeed around America.
Multitasking.
Yes, always.